We are organizing this roundtable on the occasion of the release of this new global social science research report. But we are doing it very happily today because it's also the beginning of the celebration of IDS 50th anniversary, 50 years of IDS, Institute for Development Studies in Sussex. And Dr. John Gaventa, who is currently Director of Research at IDS, is here. So welcome, John. Also delighted to launch PRIA at 35. PRIA's 35th anniversary is around the corner, and we have decided that we would have a youthful 35. The particular occasion we used is because two of the editors, authors, sponsors, collaborators of this new World Social Science Research Report are in town. I mentioned Dr. John Gaventa and also Dr. Matthew Dennis, who is the Executive Director of International Social Science Council, which along with UNESCO has co-published this report. The theme is particularly relevant and appropriate to the context in which we live and work in India. I'm delighted to have a panelist comprising of Shri Nitin Desai, Professor Jayati Ghosh, who herself has contributed a piece in this report, Gautam Modi, who is General Secretary of National Trade Union Initiative, and Dr. Singh, who is from Indian Institute of Medical Statistics. And the idea of this afternoon's roundtable is to share some of the emerging findings from this global report, but more importantly to have a conversation about what it means for us in India. And initially, our panelists will, from their vantage point, from their context, comment on the findings. More importantly, not so much debate whether the methodology of the study was rigorous enough or not, but what does it say to us for our economic policy, for our work on the ground, for our research, for our organizing efforts. And all of you are part of the research, organizing, policy context here. So without any further ado, we're going to start. As I mentioned in the program earlier, you have seen we will have initial 20 minutes between Matthew and John, and then 10 minutes each are panelists, and then open conversation with your comments and inputs. More importantly, to look at how these findings resonate with who we are, what we do, where we do, and what does it say about our work in future. And so, Matthew, welcome.
Colleagues, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for having me and providing a space for this conversation. I really feel that it's a privilege to be here and to be able to present the report, some of the conclusions, and to discuss them with you, such a selected audience, if you want. As was said, my name is Mathieu Denis. I'm the director of the International Social Science Council. I'm not going to talk very long about the council, but perhaps just say a few words about who we are and what is it that we do. So the International Social Science Council is a membership-based organization that has 65 plus international disciplinary associations as members. So the social science disciplinary secretariats are a member, as well as national research funders of social science research. We were founded in the early 1950s through a resolution of UNESCO, and for decades we've had a very strong partnership relationship and collaborative relationship with UNESCO, although the ISSC is an entirely independent organization. And I must say that the partnership with UNESCO has probably declined in the years, but if there is one product, one joint activity where this partnership is really strong, it is around the regular production of a World Social Science report. The World Social Science Report are one of the flagship activities today of the International Social Science Council. It is the third, I think we have a slide here exactly, it is the third one that the ISSC prepares. The first one was published in 2010. It was around knowledge divide, so we look at the production and use of social science knowledge around the world. The second one was in 2013 and was trying to display the breadth and diversity of the research currently made worldwide on changing environments within social sciences. So this one on inequalities is the third one. It is a big report. It has over 100 authors from more than 40 countries, 70 something contributions. It was prepared in very strong, close partnership with our colleagues from the Institute of Development Studies, based at Sussex. It has been produced in English, although there are translations on their way into French, Spanish, Portuguese. We're trying to get it translated into Arabic and Russian as well. But there are summaries available already into French and Spanish. We have, I must apologize, because we had sent a good number of executive summaries. We've had an important event yesterday at JNU with the Indian Council of Social Science Research launching this report. And so we had sent a good number of big reports and executive summaries, but somehow we got devastated and everybody rushed into them, so we don't have any left almost. So apologies for that, but it's all downloadable in open access. And I think I want to keep it to that because I want to give John more time to go into the conclusions and the main messages, but I'll be happy to answer your question.
But anyway, let me start by giving a warm thanks to PRIA for organizing this, for our co-panelists for joining, for people who are joining us, both through the PRIA network and those of you who are IDS alumni. For me, how many IDS alumni? We have more coming later, fantastic. So, I'll talk later at the tea about what IDS is doing, but one of our strategic goals is to do research on reducing inequality. This we set last year in our new strategic plan, and just about the same time we were approached by the International Social Science Council to serve as co-editors of this global volume, which we've just released. So this has been a wonderful opportunity for us also to pick up our goal of working on reducing inequality. So I've been now, IDS, as Rajesh said, is just celebrating its 50th year. I've been there for some 21 years of that time and was away for a few years and now back. So I look forward to chatting with IDS alumni later. But I've also been associated with PRIA for almost 35 years, for actually 33 of their 35 years. So for me, bringing together 21 years of IDS and 33 years of PRIA gives me 45 years I was never good at math, but it gives me 45 years of connections today, and that makes me feel very happy. So thank you all for coming. Look, there's been a lot of recognition around the world in recent years of the critical nature of the issue of inequality. I'm glad that Oxfam is here. Oxfam from civil society globally has led the charge on raising the issue of inequality. Businesses that pick this up in Davos and other places. The UN, World Bank, other institutions are now looking at inequality as a critical global issue. And if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, not only the Sustainable Development Goals have a goal 10 is to reduce inequality, but more importantly, we pledge that no one will be left behind. A cross-cutting, universal pledge, which in the SDGs applies to the North as well as to the South. Leaving no one behind is ultimately a question of inequality and not having inequality. There's been a huge amount of interest in inequality, but thus far so much of the global report and thinking has primarily been from economics, not exclusively, primarily, which is fine, but you'll see we want to broaden that. It's primarily been, if you think of the big books that have provoked debate around Piketty and Atkinson and Stiglitz from the North. And our goal was to come up with a report that was a bit more diverse that looked beyond economic inequality, that looked across the world, that looked at the consequences of inequality, not just the causes, that looked at what could we do about it, to be multidisciplinary, and to identify some knowledge gaps for future research. And I think I'm pleased to say that I think there's a lot of work, but to our knowledge, this is now the most diverse volume publicly accessible on the global issue of inequality. Diverse in the sense of the number of nationalities represented, diverse in the sense of the number of topics covered, the diverse in the sense of the number of social scientists, but also activists and journalists from around the world who have contributed. So I hope you'll take a look and download it. So it's my job in just the next few minutes to say, well, what do we learn? What's new here? But I really look forward to hearing from you about what does it mean in your context, and more specifically, what does it mean for us as academics and researchers and activists? What can we do? Now, I start with a startling fact from Oxfam. So thank you, Oxfam, because again, they keep updating some of the best reports. If you take a look at this graph, economic and political power are increasingly concentrated in the hands of a small number of people. And our argument throughout is that this concentration of wealth in the hands of a few threatens growth, threatens social cohesion, ultimately threatens healthy democracies. And look at that staggering graph. The top line blue is the wealth of the bottom 50% of the people on the planet, and the bottom line red is the wealth of the richest 62 people. The richest 62 people in the world now control as much wealth as the bottom 50% of the poorest 50% in the world. And that convergence between the wealth of the very top and the poverty of the mass of humanity has come tighter, as you see, in recent years. There's other data which talks about 1% of the world controlling 80% of the wealth or whatever, but this to me is 62 people and 50% of the world's wealth. And this challenge of the trend of global inequality has been somewhat paradoxical. So if you look at the global figures, some arguments say that actually there's been a reduction globally between those at the very bottom and those at the very top. Why? Largely because middle classes of China and India have also grown. So while some says there's been a global reduction of inequality, within those same countries, there's been an increase in inequality. And if the trend continues with the rapid increase of inequality within countries, it's also going to change this global pattern. What's also interesting is that this growth of inequality happens across the world. So in fact, inequality has been rising just as fast or even faster in the so-called developed north, in the US, UK, Japan, Germany, France, Canada, Sweden. All these countries have seen the increase of inequality, and similarly in developing countries around the world, an increase, but in certain cases, a decline. And we're going to come back to that to show that actually some countries have been able to counter this trend through their policies and programs. Inequality is particularly is felt thus around the world, but the global inequality is particularly felt in sub-Saharan Africa. I find this data particularly striking. These are the countries in which 30% of the population are amongst the bottom 10% of the global inequality ladder. So the highest concentration of the people at the bottom of the global economic ladder. And you'll see that all 16 of those countries are based in sub-Saharan Africa, with the bottom being over 80% of the people living in the bottom 10% compared to the global economic ladder. So there's consequences everywhere, global consequences in Africa, but they affect all of our countries. But our key message through this report is that we cannot understand inequality only as in terms of income and health and wealth. Income, we look at 7 forms of inequality. We looked at the interaction of economic inequality, political inequality, by which we mean inequalities of voice, social inequalities, inequalities in health we'll talk about today, health and education, social services, cultural inequalities, ethnicity, class, caste, environmental inequalities, spatial inequalities, the gaps between the urban and the rural, and even some parts of urban and other parts of urban. And very important for us as people who work largely in research, knowledge inequalities ourselves. And of course, you may quickly say, where's gender inequality? We see gender inequality as cross-cutting every one of those, particularly strong, of course, in cultural and others, but gender inequality crosses everything. And not only are these 7 forms of inequality there, but they interact in a certain way, and they interact and accumulate more for certain groups of people than for others, creating the structural form of multidimensional discrimination, multidimensional inequality that has huge effect on certain populations. I'll just give one example. If you try to look at the issue of education, and girls' education, which is very, very important, well, you could look at Nigeria and say only 3% of the poorest girls living in rural areas completed lower secondary school, and 17% of the boys did. Well, that's staggering. Given the goals on girls' education, only 3%, and we know that girls didn't do as well as boys. But it gets worse if you start bringing in the multidimensional approach, because if you look at, by contrast, 95% of the richest boys in urban areas completed secondary school. So if you add the educational inequalities with the gender inequalities, with the class inequalities, with the spatial inequalities, you find that inequality accumulates and it hits some groups more than others. So our argument is here that we cannot address any dimension of inequality separately. We have to look at them all together. Inequalities, we also point out, are important not to deal with only in and of themselves, but not only an issue of rights and ultimately moral and social justice, but inequalities are the key to dealing with so many other issues which we also work in. So it's now well documented that high and rising inequality actually can be an impediment to growth and can reduce the impact of poverty reduction programs. So even the World Bank may say, you're growing in India, but actually growth is making it more difficult to respond to poverty issue. It doesn't, this notion that trickle-down economies, that you can grow and trickle-down poverty, everybody will be lifted. That trickle-down is no longer trickling if it ever was. Inequalities limit our ability to deal with crisis. We have some very interesting work here that the greater the inequality, the less trust there is between the people and the institutions that affect their lives, and the less trust there is, the more difficult it is to respond in times of crisis. And we have a case study of the Ebola crisis, which linked inequality to the decline of trust between people and the state, and then the inability of the state to respond when the Ebola crisis hit. Inequality affects sustainability. Inequality means that certain people consume more. They consume far more than their share, and we can't look at issues of inequality of sustainability without also looking at issues of inequality. Inequality is related to nutrition and to health. We have this new staggering phenomenon around the world, what we call about the stuffed and the starved. Some people, some classes with obesity, and other people still highly undernourished. Inequality is related to conflict, and we point out that it's horizontal inequalities. Inequality between groups contributes strongly to conflict, but also the higher level of inequalities in certain countries, the more likelihood of civil war and other kinds of conflict. So our argument is that in the context of the social development goals, even though the SDGs sit right in the goal 10 is very important, we suggest that we cannot actually deal with any of the other goals unless we also deal with goal 10. So goal 5 on gender equality, other goals on poverty and growth, other goal 16 on conflict and access to justice, other goals on health, nutrition, and education, other goals on environmental sustainability and the urban environment. All of them we suggested will not be addressed unless we're also addressing the issue of inequality. It's a highly interconnected issue. Now, but the report's also important because we argue that inequality is not inevitable. And while there's a lot of work, a growing amount of work that looks at the causes of inequality and measures the inequality, there's a little less work that looks at the consequences of inequality, how people actually experience inequality. But if you turn the question around from what is the impact of inequality to ask the question, how do you move from an unequal world to a more fair world, we find even less information. So we have a whole section that first of all looks speculatively at what we call inequality futures. If inequality is going this far now, what will it be like in the future? And what are the tipping points? You know, in the climate change debates, we had lots of science research that said if you get to 2 degrees, it's a tipping point and all these other consequences will happen. We search for similar arguments about inequality. If inequality becomes so severe, at what point is the tipping point that all these other factors start interacting with each other? And we didn't find research in that area. We need much more to do on that. But speculatively, look at the future of inequality. If you look, for instance, the potential impact of automation and digitization and robotics on jobs, it could make the inequality ladder grow even worse. So we have to think about the future inequality. But the good news is we also looked a lot at what can be done about inequality. What are the strategies for building a fairer and more equal world? I'm not saying a completely equal world, that's not our goal, but we know that we have to deal with this extreme inequality that we find. And in this case, we looked around, and first of all, we found that there are successful pathways to address inequality. We found about 23 countries where, in fact, inequality has been reversed. And we also found that just like inequality leads to these other consequences, the reversal of inequality also makes it more chance that you can deal with issues such as education and health and other kinds of things. So what does it take to reverse? What does it take to act? Well, first of all, we know a lot about policies that make a difference to inequality. And we list in the report a whole series of policy level measures, but rarely can they be taken by their own. Because it's a multidimensional phenomenon, this isn't simply an issue for the macroeconomist. It isn't simply an issue for the health provision. It's cross-cutting. But the right combination of policies dealing with trade, aid, social protection, labor, tax, land reform, all of these policies together can actually make a difference, and you can have seen in certain countries inequality being reduced. And secondly, those kinds of policies, as we know from the civil society crowd, rarely happen on their own. They happen usually in response to collective social and political action. And here we see something very interesting happening around, if you measure protest around the world, and we have some studies of the protest around the world. Not only the number of sort of everyday protests increasing in many countries of the world, people on the streets protesting this and that, but for the first time in our history, since we've been measuring protests, the majority of them around economic justice issues, rather than around issues of, say, human rights or identities. So protests are happening, and social movements are rising, and increasingly they have to do with the challenge of economic inequality. What we need to see is also then integrated packages that link the collective action that can evolve. But we've also found that there's no, and we say this constantly in development, there's no one-size-fits-all. How many times have those of you at IDS hear that? It's context, context, context. That what you do to deal with the issue of inequality can't be the same in every country. So we have some very important, throughout this report, contributions from differing countries and differing regions. So in the US, inequality is deeply connected to structural racism and racial injustice. It's hard to talk about dealing with inequality in the United States unless you're willing to deal with race. In Africa, certainly as parts of rural India, inequality is deeply connected to issues of control of natural resources and land grabs and exploitation of natural resources. You can't talk about dealing with inequality unless you talk about natural resource control. In the United States and Western developed countries, inequality is quite interesting that the graphs show that over the last 20 years we've had two phenomena. We've had the growth of the elite here, and we have a bit of a growth of middle class in certain countries like India and China, but the lower end of the working classes and the middle class in the developed countries have stagnated over the 30 years. And so then you begin to see that you can't talk about inequality in those countries unless we start talking about what's happening to middle classes and the working classes, and I think that's playing out in the politics we see today around Trump and Brexit voting and all of which is protest around the current economic conditions of these groups. So the point is we have a huge global problem, but our strategies for dealing with it have to look at the local and national context in which they're sitting, and that's why the discussion today about what does this mean for India is so particularly important. Now, in all of this work, as I've said, but just to zero in a bit more, collective action by citizens is absolutely critical. And that's why it's very important and very exciting to see groups like Oxfam and others begin to say, we as civil society must challenge the whole notion of inequality. And in the question came up, it came up this morning in our PRIA conversation, how do you do it? Well, one is, dealing with inequality means building broad alliances across groups. You know, if you think about who are the grassroots and you go back to that first graph, the grassroots now are 50% of the world's population, if you look globally, right? The higher the grass goes in terms of the elites, the higher the grassroots are. So we have the opportunity to build alliances amongst many different groups because they're all being affected by this and affecting their lives. And in places like Brazil and Egypt and other places, building alliances of doctors, poor people, patients, and others has been very important. Grassroots mobilization, political action are very effective, we've talked about, but we also see around the world huge efforts by civil society to build alternative economies. Different ways to think about building livelihoods that are more sustainable, different forms of economic development and economic growth that are more equitable, and those pathways to alternatives are just as important as the resistance to the top-down inequality. And we also find that building people's voice and participation in a variety of other kinds of programs are also important. So the Zero Hunger program in Brazil, which is very important, wouldn't have happened again without the participation of civil society in developing and promoting and monitoring that program. So dealing with inequality takes everybody, and there's plenty of opportunities for civil society to play a role in this issue. Now, the final part of our report looks at inequality and knowledge, and the whole inequalities. And we make we think, a very important argument that we can't deal with global inequality unless we're willing to deal with knowledge inequalities. Now, this first graph is interesting because it shows that actually this is based on looking at just a bibliometric survey of all the articles that have the word inequality in them that are on the World Web of Science. And so you see the growth overall of studies of inequality, largely in economics, but no longer just economics, political science, sociology, education, social psychology, gender. And by the way, if we add health in there, we would see health inequality, studies of health inequality even going above social science. So that's encouraging. It's receiving more attention. But then you ask, where is this attention coming from? And you see this staggering statistic. 80% of the formal published articles, not the informal knowledge, but 80% of the formal published articles in social science literature have come from North America and Western Europe. 50% of the studies have come from only two countries, the United States and the United Kingdom. So it poses the question, how can we come up with global solutions to this global problem when the production of knowledge about that problem is so far disconnected from the people who are experiencing at the cold face. And even in South Asia and West Asia, where I know there's been a lot of work on these issues. And of course, I don't want to devalidate all the popular work and informal studies and other work that's been done, but in the global level, you're down here, there's three from the bottom in terms of production of that formal social science knowledge. And that formal social science knowledge is important because it shapes our understandings, it shapes how policymakers will respond, it shapes a global response. So we make the argument that in order to deal with global inequality, we also have to deal with knowledge inequalities. And finally, therefore, from social scientists, and this was the presentation we gave yesterday to the Indian Social Science Research Council and other people gathered at JNU. We really look for social, because this is the International Social Science Report, we look at things, priorities. Number one is increase support for knowledge production about inequality in those places most affected. Okay? Number two is improve our ability to assess and measure and compare inequality over time. One of the reasons people say that there's more studies about inequality in the North is because the data is easier to get in the North. So the tail wags the dog a little bit. We measure it because that's where we get the data, rather than we study it because that's where it's most important. So we have to think about how we get the data in places where that data is hard to get. Thirdly is we need to deepen our understanding of diverse experiences of inequality. You know that in poverty, in the field of poverty, we had this, even in India and other places, all this work of using participatory methods to understand people's experiences of poverty, voices of the poor. We began to understand the multidimensional nature of poverty. We looked around and said, where's the work on multidimensional experiences of inequality from the perspective of people, the poor people themselves? So we found very little. So we need to bring our work on the perception, how people experience inequality in everyday life. We need to capture that and bring it to the table. We need to understand how these multiple inequalities are created, but how they're maintained and reproduced. Because we tend to study things in silos, we have lots of just work on gender inequality and economic inequality and environmental inequality. We don't understand very much how in everyday life these are connected to each other. But if you go to a village and try to understand it from that community, we know that you can't separate them either. We need to understand deepen our understanding of the interaction of global and local forms of inequality. A lot of this has been driven by globalization and by global forces, but it interacts with local systems of race and caste and class that deepen the effects. We need to develop more research, as I said, not just on what is the impact of inequality, but how do we move towards greater equality. If you turn the question around and ask, how do we get from here to there? We have a lot of work to do to understand what are the pathways, the entry points, the strategies that help build a more equal and fair world. And we need to continue through all of this by new synthesis and new theorizing together on the concept of what we mean by inequality, how we understand it, and therefore how we're going to use that to really deal with what I think is the critical social justice issue of our times. So to do that means going beyond measurement. It means going beyond quantification. It means going beyond, we argue, just producing social science as we know it. It really means a new kind of social science, what IDS is now calling engaged excellence, which other people call transformative social science. It's knowledge, and what PRIA has long called participatory research. It means bringing together the people affected with the social scientists to produce a new kind of knowledge that's deeply grounded in people's lives and helps to strengthen their voices. My friends have just come in. So that's just in a very few minutes some of the top-line messages coming from this big global report. Like I say, I hope you'll take a chance to look at it yourselves, because it does give a rich, diverse set of experiences and voices from around the world.